Rethinking development in 7 minutes as a UN official is a suicidal proposition. So I must preface my remarks with, these are reflections of an individual in the context of the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit. This just as a precautionary note. Let me also say, you heard this morning already some remarkable speeches, and I think the point in time in which we find ourselves is less and less disputed. A development discourse, a development paradigm, a development century or 2 centuries have reached a point where simply extrapolating into the future is, in many respects, not a viable proposition anymore. Therefore, the title, simple as it is actually very powerful. It is a time of rethinking development. It is a difficult time to rethink development because many people still would like to pursue that path of development, which is one reason why we struggle so much in a world that is reaching its carbon space limits, reaching its freshwater resources limits, its agricultural boundaries in terms of arable soil, etc., etc. To argue today that you can look into the future of, let's say, the year 2050 and argue that we are really able to produce 70% more food in order to feed the world, as the experts tell us, to intensify agriculture through more use of water resources at a time when we already know that in a significant part of the world we are living under water stress conditions. We are actually having a net loss in arable land, and in brackets, if you're interested, last week UNEP released with the International Resources Panel a new report on global land use. The figures are stark, the mathematics do not add up. So whether it is energy, food, or water, which are the nexus discussion here this week, these 3 are first and foremost an alarm signal that a development model that simply intensifies, scales up, and multiplies the way we have gone about providing these services to an ever-growing population is not going to prove viable unless you take for granted major ecological risks, major economic risks, major security risks, and essentially premise the future of development on a model of Darwinism, a geopolitical Darwinism, where simply the strongest countries, nations, populations, and economies will make sure that they get what they need, and the rest of the world will have to figure out where it stays. Not a pretty prospect, and herein lies the reason also for why in Rio, in the year 2012, despite so many divisions and despite so many unfinished discussions amongst leaders, the notion of a Sustainable Development Goals framework emerged. In fact, it was one of the few real forward-looking outcomes that already is now being negotiated not only in New York in the open working group amongst member states, but in fact across the world. And at the core of these Sustainable Development Goals were 2 very simple, fundamental, and very disruptive concepts. 1, universality, uncomfortable in the political arena, absolutely rational from a scientific and empirical perspective. And secondly, integration. The notion of 30, 40 years ago, where there is a chronology of development. You first develop economically, then you trickle down socially, and then you have all the money to fix the ecology, is simply not a viable proposition anymore in so many respects. So the environmental or the sustainability dimension post-Rio 2012 is no longer the notion that it is a collateral of development, in the sense of collateral damage that you fix later. In fact, we live today in a moment in time that is driving the rethinking of development from the point of view that you're not there to exploit a set of natural capital resources in an economy with a view of how you would go about mining. In fact, much of what we are documenting today, whether it is through Lord Nicholas Stern's work on the economic perspective on climate change, whether it is the Global Environment Outlook reports that the United Nations Environment Programme puts out, many other institutions, scientists, the IPCC, all of them point to the fact that we are reaching tipping points, points of no return, points of economic irrationality. And therefore, the sustainability dimension will move from being, in a sense, a corollary of the sustainable development story, I think, to centrally informing and defining it, but not as environment taken out of the equation of people, economies, and livelihoods, but rather sustainability of our natural capital, management of our pollution footprint, the implications in terms of health, planetary, ecological, people's health, they will redefine the way the economics of development will work in the future. And from there, comes this very strong notion of a transition towards a green economy becomes a medium through which we can recalibrate development decisions. First of all, making the invisible visible. You heard it this morning from my former boss, Kofi Annan, who said, as long as you don't value something in our systems of national accounting, they are invisible. Therefore, they are of no value. Therefore, the only rational response in an economic setting is to exploit them. That has to change from the systems of national accounting to the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. Secondly, we also have to begin to take the distortions out of our economies that lead to these gross misallocations of capital. How can you justify keeping lead in fuels 20 years ago simply from the point of view that it gave you 3 or 4 miles more on your kilometer range of your vehicle when literally millions of people were being affected in their health? Air pollution, New Delhi, Beijing, but also Los Angeles during the Olympics when it hosted it. These are issues that are manageable. They are choices that are informed by the economics that surrounds the decision-making from a household level right up to a national economy. And here is another major issue. In trying to make these transitions happen, the science is not really any longer contested. Even the necessity, the ethics, the opportunity to address them is less and less contested. But people argue we cannot afford it. It is not financeable. It will kill jobs. It will make unemployment worse. It will make it impossible to provide energy to our people. And herein, I think, lies the great challenge of the coming years. We have to recalibrate the way that our economies value services, goods, technology, but also in traditional economic terms, externalities. And secondly, we have to also recalibrate our economies in terms of financing. And here it is interesting, and that closes the circle back to the Sustainable Development Goals. First, it is a planetary set of issues we're dealing with today. That is why we need all countries. It's a global economy within which we are acting. And thirdly, no government, whether developed or developing country government, will be able to finance from the public purse the kinds of transitions in energy systems, mobility systems, urban systems, agriculture, food security, you name the sectors of our economy, without massive investment and engagement of the private capital markets, the financial system, so to speak, beyond the budget of a public purse. And that is why also a few weeks ago we launched an inquiry into the greening of financial systems in UNEP as part of our green economy work, looking at it from the perspective of central banks, regulators, rating agencies, financial institutions, pension funds, that will help us redefine what are the conditions under which it is no longer just the right thing to do, it becomes the viable thing to do for the private sector to be incentivized to crowd into this space with massive investments. And suddenly, that argument that it is not doable, that it cannot create jobs, will vanish because the opposite will be true. We are living in a jobless recovery right now. The current economic paradigm is going to produce a recovery in inverted commas, but not more jobs. We have millions of unemployed across the globe. Where are they going to find employment? And I end here, Jay, I know I have gone over the time. When we start recalibrating our economies, for example, an ecological tax reform, why in the 21st century are we taxing labor still as a key taxation revenue income, when in fact we have millions of unemployed, and our real problem in the future will be resource efficiency and the risks it poses in terms of inefficient use to our economies. This is just a few highlights of rethinking development against the backdrop of Rio +20, but more importantly, the future of a global community of 7 to 10 billion people. Thank you.